A man sits in a cold, dimly lit prison cell, his hands trembling as he stares at the floor. The clock on the wall ticks steadily, each second bringing him closer to his final moment. Outside the heavy iron bars, guards stand silent, their faces unreadable. They know what comes next. Everyone does. But before the switch is flipped, before the room is filled with the hum of electricity, the prisoner makes one last request. Not a lavish meal, not a cigarette, not even a final conversation with a loved one. Instead, he asks for something that leaves everyone in the room momentarily stunned. He wants to see his dog. Whispers spread among the prison staff. It's unusual, unexpected. Some scoff, saying it's just another trick, another delay. Others exchange uncertain glances, wondering if this request, so simple, yet so deeply human, should be honored. But eventually, the decision is made. The dog is brought in. As the metal door creaks open, the room holds its breath. The dog walks in hesitantly, its tail wagging slightly, eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces before locking onto one, the only one that matters. And in that moment, something happens that no one, not even the prisoner himself, could have predicted. The walls of the prison are thick, the air heavy with silence. Beyond the towering steel gates, a man awaits his fate. His name is whispered through the cold hallways, spoken in hushed voices by guards and inmates alike. He is a man sentenced to die, a man whose time is running out. Inside his small, dimly lit cell, he sits on the edge of a narrow bed, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the concrete floor. He has known this moment would come. The trial, the sentencing, the long, agonizing wait, all of it has led to this night. In just a few short hours, he will walk down that hallway, past the rows of empty cells, past the men who will never see the outside world again. And at the end of that path lies the electric chair. Guards stand outside his door, their expressions unreadable. They have seen this before. Another prisoner, another final moment. But this man is different. He has not asked for a lavish meal. He has not requested a priest. He has not asked to speak to a loved one for the last time. Instead, he has made a request that stops everyone in their tracks. I want to see my dog. For a moment, there is silence. The guards exchange glances, unsure of what to say. It's not a request they hear often. Some prisoners ask for steak, some for cigarettes, some for a final moment of solitude. But a dog? It's unheard of. Rumors spread through the prison like wildfire. Some think it's a joke, a desperate attempt to stall the inevitable. Others believe it's something more, something deeper. What kind of man, knowing his life is about to end, chooses to see an animal over another human being? Despite the skepticism, the request is granted. A phone call is made. Arrangements are set. The dog will be brought in. As the minutes drag by, the air in the prison grows heavier. The guards prepare for the inevitable, their faces hard, their hands steady. But beneath the surface, something feels different this time. No one can explain it, but an eerie tension lingers in the air. Then, the sound of distant footsteps echoes through the corridor. The door at the end of the hall creaks open, and as the dog is led inside, tail wagging slightly, something happens. Something so unexpected, so unexplainable, that it will leave everyone in that room forever changed. Before he became the man sitting in a prison cell, waiting for his final moment, he was just an ordinary boy growing up in a forgotten town. His childhood was not one of laughter and warmth, but of hardship and loneliness. He had no siblings, no real friends, just a small, rundown house and a father who was always angry. But there was one bright spot in his life, one soul that never turned its back on him. A scrappy little dog with matted fur and eyes too big for its face. He had found it on the side of the road one stormy night, shivering, abandoned, unwanted, just like him. From that moment, they were inseparable. Where he went, the dog followed. Through the quiet streets, the overgrown fields, the dark alleys where no one dared to look. They were each other's family. As the years passed, life did not get easier. Mistakes were made, choices that could not be undone. The kind of choices that turn a man into something he never thought he'd become. He fell in with the wrong people, people who promised him a way out, but only led him deeper into the darkness. One bad decision turned into another, and before he knew it, he was standing in a courtroom, facing the weight of his actions. Through it all, the dog never left him, even when the world turned against him, when the jury whispered behind closed doors, when the headlines condemned him before the sentence was even spoken. His dog still waited. Through steel bars, through endless days of isolation, it would come to visit, tail wagging, eyes filled with the same unwavering loyalty it had from the very beginning. For years, it was the only living thing that reminded him he was still human, the only thing that saw something in him worth saving. And now, as he sat in that cold prison cell, staring down the final hours of his life, he knew there was only one face he wanted to see before he left this world. Not the family that had turned their backs, not the friends who had long since disappeared, not even the priest offering last-minute salvation. Just his dog, the only one who had ever truly known him, the only one who had never judged him. But what he didn't know, what no one could have known, was that this final meeting would not go as planned, that this simple request, this final moment, would change everything in ways no one could have imagined. The prison was silent, a silence so thick, so suffocating, it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The guards moved with an eerie stillness, their boots echoing against the cold concrete floors as they made their way down the long, dimly lit corridor. They had done this before, too many times to count, and yet, tonight felt different. Inside his cell, the man sat motionless. His hands rested on his lap, his fingers barely twitching. The reality of what was about to happen pressed down on him like an unbearable weight, yet his face remained unreadable. He had known this moment would come. The appeals had failed, the clock had run out. But as the heavy iron door creaked open, as the guards stepped inside to take him on his final walk, there was no fear in his eyes, just quiet acceptance. One of the guards cleared his throat. "It's time." The chains clinked as they wrapped around his wrists. He did not resist. He did not speak. The long walk to the execution chamber had begun. Step by step, he moved through the dim corridor, past the rows of empty cells, past the other inmates who now stood silently behind their bars. Some watched with indifference. Others muttered words too low to hear. A few turned away. No one ever knew what to say in these moments. As he approached the final hallway, the heavy steel door at the end slowly began to open. Beyond it, the execution chamber waited, bright, sterile, prepared for what was about to happen. But before he could take another step, something stopped him. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable, the tapping of nails on the concrete floor. A small figure emerged from around the corner, led carefully by a prison worker. Its head tilted, ears perked, nose twitching as it took in the unfamiliar surroundings. And then, suddenly, it saw him. The dog froze for just a second, just long enough to register the scent, the sight, the presence of the only person it had ever truly loved. And then it moved, not cautiously, not hesitantly, but with absolute certainty. The tail wagged, the paws hurried, the leash barely holding it back as it pulled toward him with everything it had. The prisoner stopped in his tracks, his breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, his hands trembled, not from fear, not from regret, but from something far deeper, something he could not explain. He knelt down as the guards hesitated, uncertain whether to allow it. The dog whined, straining against the leash, desperate to reach him. And then, in an unexpected act of mercy, the worker let go. The moment the leash slipped free, the dog leaped forward. Not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the pure, unshakable love that had never faded, not even through the cold steel bars, not even through the endless days of waiting. The room stood still. No one spoke, no one moved. The execution was supposed to continue. The process was set in stone. But at that moment, with the dog pressed against his chest, its body trembling with excitement, its eyes filled with nothing but trust, something in the air shifted, something no one could explain. And then, the dog did something that made every person in that room freeze where they stood. Something that changed everything. The dog clung to him, its small body trembling, pressing into his chest as if it knew this was the last time it would ever see him. Its tail wagged frantically, but its whimpers told a different story. It wasn't just excitement, it wasn't just love, it was desperation, a silent plea. Don't go. The room remained still. Even the guards, men who had long since hardened their hearts to moments like these, said nothing. They had seen last requests before. Family members crying, prisoners whispering prayers, final meals eaten in quiet solitude. But this was something else. The prisoner held the dog close, running his fingers through its fur, breathing in its familiar scent. For the first time in years, warmth spread through his chest. For a brief moment, he wasn't in a prison. He wasn't a condemned man. He wasn't moments away from death. He was just a boy again, on the side of the road, scooping up a lost, shivering pup in the middle of a storm. But then, the dog did something that made every single person in that room freeze. Its tail stopped wagging. The excited pants slowed. Its ears perked up, its nose twitching rapidly as if it had caught an unfamiliar scent. And then, just as quickly as it had rushed into his arms, it pulled away. The dog backed up slightly, its head lowering, its eyes locked onto him in a way they never had before. Something had changed. The prisoner frowned, his heart pounding. "What's wrong, boy?" he murmured, reaching out again. But the dog didn't move. It didn't whimper, didn't bark. It just stared. And then, without warning, it growled. A low, guttural sound, deep from its chest. The guards tensed. The warden stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a reaction anyone had expected. The prisoner's breath hitched. His dog had never growled at him before. Not once in all the years they had been together. Not when he had been angry. Not when he had been scared. Not when he had been locked away in this prison, waiting for the end. And yet, now, of all times, his dog looked at him as if he were a stranger, as if it saw something the rest of them didn't. The growl deepened, the dog's fur bristling. Its stance shifted, not one of fear, but of warning. A chill crept through the air. The guards, once silent spectators, now shifted uneasily. The warden exchanged glances with his officers. The tension in the room was no longer just emotional, it was unnerving. Then, the dog did something even more shocking. It took a step back, away from the prisoner, then another, and another, until suddenly, as if an invisible force had taken hold of it, the dog let out a sharp yelp and bolted to the farthest corner of the room, pressing itself against the wall, tail tucked, eyes wide with terror. The prisoner's stomach dropped. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, boy, come here." But the dog wouldn't move. It wouldn't come near him. It was afraid of him. And that's when the whispers started. Low murmurs among the guards, uneasy shuffling, shifting feet. The execution had been set in stone. The process was supposed to be routine. But now they were all questioning something none of them dared to say out loud. What had changed? What had the dog seen? The air inside the room thickened, the weight of something unseen pressing down on every single person in that chamber. And for the first time since his sentencing, the prisoner felt it too. Something was wrong. The room was deathly silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The dog, once so eager, so desperate to be in the arms of its owner, now cowered against the farthest wall, its body trembling, its eyes filled with something no one could understand. Fear. Not fear of the room, not fear of the guards, not fear of the electric chair that loomed just feet away. Fear of him. The prisoner's breath came shallow, his fingers twitching as he slowly extended a hand. "Come here, boy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. But the dog didn't move. It pressed itself further against the wall, as if trying to disappear into the concrete, as if putting more distance between them was the only thing keeping it safe. A cold dread seeped into the air. The guards, who had spent years watching men walk this final path, suddenly found themselves shifting uneasily. Some stole glances at each other, exchanging silent, uncertain looks. Others swallowed hard, their fingers unconsciously tightening around the belts that held their weapons. They weren't sure why, but something about this didn't feel right. One of the officers stepped forward. "Maybe we should—" "No." The warden's voice cut through the tension, sharp and controlled, but even he hesitated before finishing his sentence. He had seen plenty of men meet their end in this chamber, watched them break down, cry, beg, or accept their fate in eerie silence. But never, not once, had he seen an animal react like this. And that's what made it unsettling. The prisoner's face twisted with something between confusion and devastation. He turned to the guards, to the warden, to anyone who could give him an answer, but none of them could, because none of them knew. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Why is he looking at me like that?" No one answered. The dog let out a low, pitiful whimper, its ears flattened against its head. It was the kind of sound that sent chills up a person's spine, not because of what it meant, but because of what it didn't. This wasn't just sadness. This wasn't just an animal sensing loss. This was terror. The prisoner swallowed hard, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He had faced a judge, a jury, the weight of his own sins. But nothing had ever made him feel this kind of fear. Because if the dog, his dog, was looking at him like this, then what did that mean? Did it see something in him no one else could? Had he changed in a way even he couldn't recognize? Or worse, had he been something else all along? A chill ran through his body, creeping up his spine like icy fingers. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to look away from the dog, to focus on the cold, indifferent faces of the men around him. But for the first time since he stepped into this prison, he realized none of them were looking at him the same way anymore. There was hesitation now, uncertainty, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. They had walked into this chamber believing one thing, but now, watching the dog, watching him, they weren't so sure anymore. Something had changed, and in that moment, for the first time since the sentence had been handed down, a single haunting question hung in the air. A question no one dared to ask. A question that sent a shiver through every man in that room. Had they made a mistake? The tension in the execution chamber had become suffocating, thick like a fog that refused to lift. No one spoke, no one even breathed too loudly. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional shuffle of uneasy feet. The prisoner, once resigned to his fate, now sat frozen in place, not because of the chains around his wrists, but because of the unmistakable weight of doubt pressing down on everyone in the room. The dog had not moved. It remained in the corner, its small body pressed so tightly against the wall that its ribs visibly expanded and contracted with every panicked breath. Its eyes never left him. The way it looked at him was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was as if it no longer recognized him. Or worse, it did. A soft murmur broke the silence. The guards, once confident in their duty, now shifted uncomfortably, exchanging hesitant glances. Even the executioner, a man who had carried out his work with cold efficiency for years, seemed frozen in place, his hand hovering just inches above the lever. One of the senior officers cleared his throat. His voice, though low and firm, carried an edge of uncertainty. "Sir, are we sure we should proceed?" The warden turned sharply, fixing him with a hard glare, but even he did not answer immediately. He had followed protocol, read the files, reviewed every detail of this case 100 times over, and yet, standing here now, Watching this animal recoil in terror from its own master, something gnawed at the back of his mind. It wasn't logic, it wasn't evidence, it was instinct. Something was wrong. The prisoner shook his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You all saw it," he murmured. "You saw the way he looked at me." His eyes darted around the room, searching for confirmation, for an answer, any answer. But all he found were troubled expressions. The warden exhaled, rubbing his temples as if trying to force the unease out of his mind. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but there was no real conviction in his voice. Still, the protocol was clear. The sentence had been handed down. The governor had denied the appeal. The execution had to proceed. And yet, the dog whined again, a sharp, broken sound that cut through the tension like a knife. The executioner shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if the dog means nothing," the warden snapped, but his tone lacked its usual authority. He turned sharply to the prisoner. "Get in the chair." But for the first time since this process had begun, the prisoner did not immediately comply. He did not rise. He did not move. He only looked down at his hands, his fingers twitching slightly as if his own skin had become unfamiliar to him. "I don't understand," he murmured. "Why is he afraid of me?" No one had an answer, and yet that single question hung in the air, lingering, heavy, dangerous. The executioner's grip on the lever tightened, but his hands were damp with sweat. The guards, once still and formal, now seemed tense, uncertain, waiting for someone to say something that would make sense of the scene before them. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then, a voice broke the silence. "Stop!" It was the warden. Every head turned toward him. The guards froze. The executioner's breath hitched. Even the prisoner looked up, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What did you say, sir?" one of the officers asked cautiously. The warden hesitated. He had never done this before. He had never wanted to do this before. But something about this moment, about the sheer weight of wrongness pressing against his chest, made him hesitate in a way that no man in his position ever should. His eyes flickered toward the dog, still cowering, still unwilling to go near its master. His jaw tightened. "I said stop." A murmur swept through the chamber. Some guards looked relieved, others looked nervous. The executioner exhaled sharply, his grip loosening on the switch. The warden turned to one of the officers. "Get me the governor on the phone, now." The officer hesitated. "But sir, the order—" "I know what the damn order says," the warden snapped. "I also know what I just saw." His gaze hardened. "Make the call." The room remained tense, but something had shifted. The process had been interrupted. The certainty that had filled this chamber when the prisoner walked in had been shattered. The prisoner sat still, staring blankly ahead, his mind racing. Had the dog just saved his life? Or had it revealed a truth no one was ready to face? Because as much as the warden wanted to say he was stopping this out of caution, out of uncertainty, the real reason was much more terrifying. He wasn't sure they were about to execute the right man, or worse, he wasn't sure they were about to execute a man at all. The execution chamber remained silent, but the air was thick with something unspoken, something that lingered long after the decision had been made. The guards, the warden, the executioner, each of them stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. The prisoner, still strapped to the chair, didn't move. He barely seemed to breathe. The chains around his wrists felt lighter now, though they hadn't loosened at all. The weight that pressed on his chest before, of finality, of inevitability, had shifted into something else entirely. Doubt. The warden turned away from him, pacing toward the heavy steel doors. His hands were clenched into fists, the veins in his temples pulsing as his mind wrestled with the consequences of his own words. He had stopped an execution. He had done something no warden in this prison's history had ever dared to do. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a mistake. The guards remained at their posts, but their posture had changed. They were no longer carrying out a routine procedure. They were witnesses to something far greater, something unnatural. The phone call had been made, the governor had been informed, the execution was halted indefinitely. But why? No one could say for certain. No one wanted to voice the thoughts swirling in their minds. All they knew was that a dog, a simple dog, had reacted in a way that no one could explain. And in doing so, it had shattered everything they thought they knew about guilt, justice, and the truth. The prisoner's hands twitched slightly. He finally turned his head, his eyes flickering toward the farthest corner of the room. The dog was still there, still pressed against the wall, still refusing to come near him. It knew something, and so did they. The aftermath was chaotic. The media caught wind of the last-minute decision, and soon reporters flooded the prison gates demanding answers. The headlines exploded across every news outlet. Execution halted in unprecedented decision. Warden overrules court order. A dog's fear saves a man's life. Was he innocent all along? Mystery surrounds last-minute stay of execution. What really happened? The world wanted answers. Investigations were reopened. Legal teams scrambled. Protesters gathered outside, some chanting for his release, others demanding his execution be reinstated. But amidst the frenzy, amidst the arguments and debates, one chilling truth remained unspoken. The prisoner himself had no idea what had just happened. He knew his dog. He had raised it, cared for it, loved it. There was no reason, no logical reason, for it to have feared him in that moment. And yet, the way it had looked at him, the way it had shrunk away, it haunted him. Days turned into weeks. The prison fell under intense scrutiny. Experts analyzed every detail of his case. Some fought for his exoneration. Others remained convinced of his guilt. But in the quiet of his solitary cell, the prisoner sat motionless, staring at his own reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the sink. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what he saw staring back at him. Outside, the dog had been taken in by a shelter. Offers poured in to adopt him, but the staff noticed something strange. The dog, once friendly and full of life, no longer trusted strangers. It avoided people, often hiding in the corner of its kennel, shaking. Whatever had happened in that room, whatever the dog had seen, it had changed him too. Over time, the prisoner's name became more of a legend than a legal case. His execution was never reinstated. He remained behind bars, neither condemned nor freed, existing in a limbo that no one could explain. Some believed he had been spared by fate. Others whispered darker theories, that the dog had sensed something in him that human eyes could not see. That maybe, just maybe, he wasn't innocent, and maybe he wasn't even human. The prison was eerily quiet. Outside, the world had moved on. The news cycle had shifted. New stories had taken center stage, but the questions remained. The prisoner, his fate left unresolved, sat in his cell, staring at the wall as the weight of everything, the confusion, the doubt, the fear, pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He couldn't shake the image of the dog's eyes, wide with terror, fixed on him in that final moment before everything had changed. Was it a warning? Was it a sign? Or had he been so consumed by his past that he had failed to recognize the true horror that had been staring him in the face? The walls felt closer now, tighter, like they were closing in on him. He had been granted life, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a cage that was even more confining than the one he had been placed in when he first arrived. He couldn't go forward, couldn't go back. He couldn't even look at himself the same way. But what had the dog seen? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. One of the guards entered, holding a piece of paper. The prisoner didn't look up, didn't move. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm of prison life, the monotonous routine that blurred the lines between days, between moments, between what was real and what was an illusion. The governor's decision has come through, the guard said, his voice flat. The prisoner didn't respond. They're keeping you here. No execution. The prisoner's heart sank. He didn't know what to feel anymore. He should have felt relief, but instead he felt hollow, like a ghost drifting through a world that no longer made sense. "What does that mean for me?" he asked quietly, his voice almost unrecognizable. The guard shrugged. "You'll be here a while longer, but there's more. People are questioning the evidence. They're asking for a retrial." A retrial. The thought made his stomach churn. He had never believed in justice, not the way other people did. He had seen too much of the world's cruelty to think that anything had the power to save him, to change the truth. But now, it felt like something had shifted. Something outside of him, outside of the law, had intervened. The dog's face, those pleading eyes, kept returning to him. There was no way to explain it, no way to wrap his mind around what had happened. But it didn't matter. The question wasn't why the dog had reacted that way. The question was, what did it mean for him? The sound of the dog's whine echoed in his mind. The last time he had heard it, the last time he had felt it in his soul. And now, that sound had become something more than just a memory. It had become a reflection of his own fear. Fear that maybe the dog had seen something in him, something dark. The room felt colder now. The walls, which once seemed like an unbreakable fortress, now felt like a prison of his own making. He couldn't escape what had been done, what had been left undone, and what had been hidden from view. The truth. The real truth. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts again, but this time it wasn't a guard. The dog stood at the threshold, its eyes now calm, its posture relaxed. There was no hesitation, no fear, just a quiet understanding that seemed to pass between them. The prisoner slowly stood up, his heart racing. This time there was no growl, no whimper. The dog walked toward him slowly, deliberately, until it was just a few feet away. And then, as if on cue, it sat. The prisoner took a hesitant step forward, and then another. He reached out a trembling hand, and the dog, without hesitation, placed its head in his palm. There was no terror now, no fear, only an acceptance, a strange, undeniable connection. As the prisoner stood there, his hand resting on the dog's fur, a thought occurred to him. Had the dog really known something? Had it seen something in him, something dark and hidden? Or had it simply been a mirror, reflecting the truth that he had never allowed himself to see? Maybe, just maybe, the dog had been there not to save him, but to show him the only thing that could truly set him free, himself. And as the dog looked up at him with eyes filled with no judgment, no hatred, no fear, only understanding, the prisoner finally understood the true cost of what had happened. Sometimes, the truth isn't something that can be understood. Sometimes, it's something that has to be felt. And in that moment, the prisoner felt it. The heavy weight of everything he had done and everything he had tried to bury. The walls had never been so close, but somehow, he felt more free than he had ever felt in his entire life. The dog stayed by his side, its warmth a reminder that some bonds were never meant to be broken. And as the warden's footsteps echoed down the hallway, the prisoner realized, perhaps it wasn't about redemption. Perhaps it was about the one thing that truly mattered, being seen. In the end, the prisoner was left to face what no one else had ever seen before. The man he had been, the man he had become, and the man he still had the chance to be. As the camera slowly fades in on the prisoner and the dog, the emotional weight of everything that's happened lingers in the air. The viewer can still feel the heavy silence, the questions that remain unanswered, and the uneasy feeling that only the truth can provide. And as the final moments play out, the voice of the narrator returns, gentle, yet carrying the weight of everything we've witnessed. Thank you all for watching until the very end. It's a powerful story, one that leaves us all questioning how we see the world and how we see ourselves. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the story and the mystery behind that fateful moment. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, The truth is never as simple as it seems.